Most gardeners think worms will take care of themselves, that as long as there's mulch and moisture, they'll stick around. But when temperatures begin to drop and the soil cools, worms go into survival mode. They burrow deeper, slow their activity, and stop reproducing. What most people don't realize is that the single biggest factor that determines whether your worms survive winter isn't temperature, it's food. And if you haven't fed them properly before frost sets in, you're starving the very creatures that keep your beds alive through the cold months. Worms don't just need a blanket of mulch, they need a stocked pantry beneath it. Let's break down what's really happening underground and what steps you can take right now to protect your worm population before frost steals their food. Worms don't hibernate, they retreat when food runs out. By late fall, the surface layer of your garden starts to cool and dry faster than the layers below. When that happens, organic matter on top begins decomposing slowly or stops entirely. Microbes slow down, meaning there's less biological activity for worms to feed on. Worms rely heavily on partially decomposed material, not fresh scraps and not finished compost. When that middle zone of soft, microbe-rich material disappears, they retreat deep into the soil where oxygen is lower and reproduction halts. This is why spring gardens often start off sluggish. Your worm population has crashed over winter because it had nothing to eat. To keep worms active longer, they need a steady supply of soft organic material breaking down in the top 6 inches of soil, even as temperatures drop. This is where most gardeners fail. A thin mulch layer isn't enough. What they need is a slow-release winter food source that doesn't rot too fast or freeze solid. The secret is in building a fall feeding layer, not just mulch. Before frost arrives, you should feed your soil the same way you'd stock a compost bin, with a balanced mix of carbon and nitrogen materials that break down slowly. Aged manure, rotting leaves, grass clippings, and a touch of finished compost form the ideal worm pantry. The goal is to keep decomposition happening gradually through the cold so microbes remain active and worms always have something to graze on. To create this layer, start by pulling back your mulch and spreading a 2-inch layer of semi-decomposed materials directly over the soil. The best ratio is 2 parts carbon-rich browns, like shredded leaves or straw, to 1 part nitrogen-rich greens, like grass clippings or kitchen scraps. Avoid large chunks of fresh waste that may freeze into a hard layer. Once this mix is spread, cover it again with 3 to 4 inches of mulch. Leaves, wood chips, or straw all work. This creates an insulated feeding zone beneath the mulch where decomposition can continue well into winter. Moisture management keeps the feeding layer alive. Cold soil tends to dry out more slowly, but winter air can still pull moisture away from the surface. Without adequate moisture, microbes die off and worms can't feed. The key is to water the bed lightly after creating your fall feeding layer. It shouldn't be soaked, just damp like a wrung-out sponge. This keeps microbial activity stable and prevents the feeding zone from going dormant. If you live in an area with heavy frost, consider placing a thin cardboard or burlap sheet beneath the mulch layer. This traps moisture and prevents the feeding mix from drying out too fast while still allowing air to circulate. In raised beds, moisture loss is faster, so water once every 10 to 14 days until the soil freezes solid. The microbes feed first, and worms follow. Worms don't eat raw materials directly. They feed on the microbial film that grows as organic matter breaks down. That's why feeding the microbes first is essential. To kickstart decomposition in your feeding layer, add a small amount of compost tea or diluted molasses water, just 1 teaspoon of unsulfured molasses per gallon of dechlorinated water, and pour it evenly over the new layer before mulching. This small carbon boost activates bacteria and fungi without creating anaerobic conditions. Within a week, microbes will begin breaking down the new organic matter producing warmth and food for the worms. In effect, you're building a living buffet beneath your mulch. Worms will migrate toward this zone, feed on it throughout fall, and retreat deeper only when the upper layer finally cools down. When spring arrives, they'll return to find an already active soil ecosystem waiting, not a dead, compacted surface. Clay and sandy soils need different feeding strategies. Clay soil holds moisture longer, which helps microbial life survive winter, but it also compacts easily in cold weather. Before building your worm-feeding layer, just loosen the top few inches of clay gently with a fork to create small air pockets. Then, add your 2-to-1 carbon to nitrogen mix and mulch on top. This prevents the soil from sealing shut and gives worms easy entry points when they surface to feed. The late-season feeding layer becomes your spring jumpstart. By the time winter breaks, the feeding layer you created will have transformed into a rich layer of humus packed with worm castings and microbial life. This becomes your spring soil conditioner. No extra work required. Worms that survived on the slow feed zone will start multiplying early, aerating and fertilizing the soil naturally. You'll notice that your spring seedlings take root faster and your soil stays looser after each rain. Gardeners who skip this step often find that their soil feels lifeless and compacted when thawing begins, forcing them to rebuild microbial activity from scratch. By contrast, those who prepare a feeding layer in autumn essentially keep their soil alive through winter. Before frost sets in, think beyond mulch. Mulch protects, but food sustains. A well-fed worm population means healthy soil biology, faster spring recovery and better harvests year after year. Make this the season you stop starving your soil life and start nurturing it all winter long. If this guide helped you understand how to keep your worm population strong through the cold, don't forget to share it with fellow gardeners who might still be missing the crucial step. Subscribe to Hydro Haven for more in-depth guides on soil biology, regenerative composting, and proven techniques that keep your beds alive no matter the season.